So welcome to this video, which is an example of a retouch from a seminar or hands-on session held with the Photo Talks group in St Albans. An amazing bunch of people, nice photographers. So to all of those who were there, thank you for braving the elements. When I first came and gave a talk back in April or whenever it was, of course I saw these lights and thought it'd be wonderful to have a twilight shot. In the end, I did this in December and it was raining and cold and pitch black. So a slightly different view, but like I said, I made the promise that I create at least one image, and I suspect we've created a couple, which will sit fairly comfortably in our portfolio. And the other is I'll always be very honest. So I'll try and show you the workflow as I do it, and I'll be honest about exactly what I'm doing. If you have any questions at all, drop me an email and I will endeavour to answer everything or create other little tutorials explaining the little details. It's quite hard to do this and know what all of the questions will be. So these are the images I shot that night, and as you can see it was a pretty dark night. Sophie, bless her, is not only a really beautiful girl, but she's also a good friend of ours, and braved the elements without once moaning. And above and beyond the call of duty, I would suggest. So these are the images, and the first of the retouch videos I'm going to do is on this image here, I think, which has got Sophie. This is obviously I think a fluorescent or a phosphor light here, and Sophie is actually lit by an off-camera flash being triggered from my camera. This is shot on my D4. I'm lying amongst gravestones to do this, for anybody who wasn't at the session, with my assistant holding the light at an angle so that it comes from this area here on the right. And the illusion we'll create is that Sophie's being lit by the light overhead. Of course, you can see from these shadows here, that's blatantly not true, but people very rarely, I mean photographers all dissect these images, but normal, everyday folk don't. So the first thing I'm going to do is to get the tones of the image about where I want them before I open it in Photoshop. And my intention at this point, I'm going to Photoshop this live. I'm not quite sure where we'll end up, and I quite like working like that. It's all, you know, a process of discovery. I think looking at the black and white version of the image, this is going to be a black and white image almost certainly, or something very akin to it. If we take the saturation down, so it might not be quite a full black and white, but we might just take the colour out. However, the first thing we're going to do is, with this raw file, is create a really good Photoshop file that has all of the tones in it. If I bring this down, the exposure all the way down, you can see that actually I have blown a lot of the highlights in this light here. I knew I would. To be able to capture the dynamic range between these dark shadows and the light, I always knew that I was going to struggle a little bit in containing the highlights in the light. However, that's not really a problem, in the same way that the sun, when it's in shot, almost always blows the highlights. So it does here too. All I've got to be very careful of is in the final image, this doesn't go to paper white, because your eyes would expect this to be this bright. So first thing I'm going to do, put the exposure where I want it, and I am going to work on the skin tones first to control everything else second. So for skin tones, my personal preference is to have these around about the 80 mark in the skin highlights. Okay, and Sophie's already there very much. As I'm rolling the mouse over here, you can see it. You can't see it when I do that, but underneath the histogram in Lightroom, you get the light values. So these are about right. The light's pretty consistent, which is really, really good. I'm going to push up the shadows a little bit in the blacks, so they're no longer clipping. If you want to see them clipping, if you hit the J button in Lightroom, so you can see my highlights clipping. If I bring the blacks down, eventually you'll see those are the blacks clipping. And I want the shadows just to be clipping where they're at their deepest, so round about there maybe. Looking at this, you can see the noise that I've got from the sensor in the shadows. That's not too much of a worry. We'll kill a little bit of it, just smooth it out in the luminance channel. We've got rain in there too, which has the effect, it looks like noise, it's not, it's just rain. It really was raining when we took this image. Just going to push the shadows a little higher, just leaving some black in there. What I'm then going to do is just colour balance as best I can this light here. I don't know what the chemistry of the light was, whether it was sulphur or fluorescent. So I'm just going to put a grad in here where you can see the transition from my flash gun light source, which is broadly daylight, to the greeny yellow of this light up here. I'm just going to use a grad to do that. I'm just going to take a little bit of blue and I'm going to take some of the green out until it looks about right. I might even just knock the exposure down a little as well. There we go, just a smidge. Until all of that looks like it's blended in. That's not too bad. Again, if I do decide to leave the image in colour or semi-colour, I want the illusion that Sophie is being lit by this light, and having two separate colour temperatures here would somewhat defeat the object. The reason the light looks like this is actually I'm lying on a ridge along here, you can see it, which gives quite a hard edge to the front of the photo. Again, I'm not too worried about that, I quite like that, as it effectively, unless you look closer, it looks like a shadow line, so it looks like she's under a pool of light coming down here and round. So with all of that, that looks more or less where I want it. I'm going to create a Photoshop file and edit it in Photoshop. Whenever I'm working on something like this, I will always duplicate the background layer. The reason for that is if I decide at some point in the future that I want to re-edit the file, I might not want to go back to the raw file to do it. And if I've already done edits on my background, I have to do that. So I always create a duplicate layer, and this is what I'm now going to work on. First thing I do though is straighten this layer so that the center of the image is properly vertical. Whenever you're straightening something, it's tricky because verticals are not always what you think they are. If you think a two-point or multi-point perspective, rather, sometimes the verticals are converging and diverging. So you do this by eye, that's about right. So I've now got that nice and straight, and now I can start to fix all of the little bits and pieces that I want to. Whenever I'm looking at a file like this, I'm really just looking firstly for all of the distractions. This is before I do any body reshaping or tiny bits and pieces on the subject of the photo. The first thing I want to do is get the overall edits about right, the overall junk, if you like, out of the shot. And this leaf here is one of those, so I'll just use the heel brush to get rid of that very quickly. And any little marks that might be a distraction. You know, this is ISO 2200, remember, so some of the sharpness you would expect off the D4 is missing just because the ISO's up. I'm not going to clean too much of it, I want it to look real, but this is a fairly normal. I just don't want any distractions. Getting in the way. Okay, so having done that, now we can start to look at Sophie. Now I've deliberately picked a picture where her eyes are looking down rather than at the camera, just because I like the feel of it a little more. One of the difficulties obviously with posing someone at night is you can't, or certainly with a flash rather than continuous lighting, is I can't actually see quite what I'm doing until I fire the flash and then have a look at the back of the camera. And obviously the speed we're working to keep everything warm, there's always going to be bits of the image that I'd like to change. And also as an exercise in showing what I would do, I'm going to do some edits on Sophie that I probably wouldn't normally bother to do with someone who's as photogenic as she is. But let's have a look, and I'll go through some of the steps. The first obvious thing is that there is a frayed edge on her dress, so we'll get rid of that. Now my view of when you're doing this kind of work is if you're doing photoshopping into an edge like this, so along this edge I'm going to try and maintain the edge of the dress, but I'm going to do some photoshopping. If you try and stamp tool in close to something like this, it never looks, to my mind, quite right, though I think I'll get away with it here. So normally what I would do is I will create a new layer just for a temporary, I won't bother renaming it, stamp everything in, not worry too much. Okay, I'm exaggerating this slightly to show what I would do. Put a mask on it, and then with a fairly soft brush, just mask that back out. and that way I've got complete control of the edges, and if I need to go back anytime, then I can. Okay, so that's nice and sharp. Okay, and then I just merge that down. Okay, I usually do any body reshaping and all of this kind of retouch work before I do all of my skin work. So all I'm doing is cleaning up the edges. There's nothing too jaggy sticking out. It was a windy day. Bless her, Sophie was brilliant. Okay, that looks good. I can see. Okay, so now I'm going to do the body work. Again, like I said, with Sophie I wouldn't normally bother, but if you wanted to, for instance, if I wanted to pinch her waist, there's a couple of ways of doing it. Always I'll work on a new layer. So that's, if I solo this layer, you can see what it is. And I will convert that into a smart object. I always work on smart objects. Now my favourite way of working on a layer like this is to use the warp tool rather than the liquify tool. I'm not a huge fan of liquify. I don't think it's got a lot of control, and I've seen too many images over liquefied. But if I wanted to pinch someone's waist or just change their profile a little bit, this is a much more versatile way of doing it. The reason being, I've got a lot of control over it, and if I want to change that, I can simply go back and redo it. Because I've done it on a smart layer, smart object layer, it gives me a lot of versatility. Not too worried. I mean, Sophie is super slim, and that was the only thing, is the way I posed her, I made a little bit too much of her waist. If I wanted to just enlarge her chest line a smidge, now I've actually shrunk it in with her waist. Again, I'm just going to very gently and I will keep saying throughout this is not the kind of photoshopping necessarily we would do, but given I was working with a model who has given me permission to do these techniques, to show the different ways of doing it, then I will do it. At that point, I will now just do a very quick skin retouch if she needs it. Let's have a quick look in here. I can't see too much that needs doing, maybe just because there's a very hard shadow on her knuckle here. No, there's nothing much, but again, in the interest of showing you, I'll do it. Now I've put these together in actions, and I'll create another video to show how I would do it using this is a basic variation of frequency separation. Okay, so I've now created this layer. So this is the layer I'm working on, which is the high frequency layer, and then there's a tone layer, which is all of the low frequency. So in here, let's going to work on this layer just to, whenever you do work like this, you've always got your finger hovering over the undo key, and all I'm doing is just stamping tones across, and I'm doing it where I get it wrong, which is invariably the way you do it. Just take out any nut, and this, strictly speaking, doesn't need doing. Sophie is so slender, and her skin, she's healthy and young, but if you're doing fashion work or model work, you need to know some of these techniques. I'm just going to very gently undo that. That's made her knuckle look too blocky. So I'm just going to very gently just take the edge off that shadow. And my general feeling about retouching with portraits as opposed to commercial work is I'll only do it if it was me that created the problem, or if, for instance, they've got acne or a scar, or something that if I'd have taken a picture at a different point or in a different way, it wouldn't have been the way it's ended up. So if I've posed someone who is or I've posed someone in a way that makes them look wide around the hips or round around the waist, I might gently correct it so that it looks the way it should do had I got the pose right. I do not, as a rule, do photoshopping, cosmetic photoshopping. I have a teenage daughter and I don't particularly agree with it. However, that's not to say you shouldn't learn the techniques. Okay, so more or less the shape of that's about right now for me. What I now need to do is to decide what I want the light and dark of the shadow of the image to be. So I'm going to just, there's loads of different ways of doing dodging and burning. In this instance, I'm going to use a very simple technique of having a couple of curved layers with masks that I can paint in as I want them. So if I just, I'm just going to accentuate the shadows on her cheek, a little bit up here, just some of the structure in her collarbone. With muscle tone and things, by doing this I'm actually accentuating her muscles a bit, but I'm not too worried about that. This can be nice and shadowed up a little bit underneath. A bit of shadow under her chest. And depending on what I'm trying to achieve, very often with the folds in material, I'll just accentuate them ever so slightly. I don't always do this, but it can sometimes just add a bit of character to the shot. And given I've heavily side lit this shot anyway, it won't do any harm. And then I'm just going to bring out some highlights and maybe just, again, I'm showing these techniques for the sake of it really. The shot isn't bad as it is. But with hair, if I'm doing hair work, just looking at where the reflections sit and just accentuating them slightly. And then this there's light reflected off the wall, I'm just going to make the most of that, as it gives a nice character to the shot. Just here on her neck. Okay. So if I just bring that up, and I'll show you before and after. I'm just adding a little bit of character. Again, it's very much a personal thing. Strictly speaking, she didn't need it. So if I go back to the copy of the background layer, you can see at this point what we've done. What I'm then going to do is I am going to create a vignette. But what I'm going to do, my view of vignetting is if ever I create a vignette, I never ever want it to be noticed. So I'm going to show you very quickly how I do that. All I'm going to just do is do a very quick as a starting point. I'm going to create a selection, which I'm then going to feather. Let's try 25 pixels so it's nice and soft. And then I'm going to create a new adjustment layer, and there's lots of ways of doing this. My personal preference is to use an exposure layer because I can just move the gamma. Just invert that mask. And you can kind of see what I'm trying to do. Okay, now I haven't really I didn't soften that edge enough, so I'm just going to soften the mask. And then using the mask, I can paint on here, firstly in black just to soften this edge, and I quite like just a hint of the door here. Quite like the door showing because it just adds a little bit of narrative. And you can see, I mean, anyone actually sits and works it out can see I've got two light sources and there's no way this would be the shadow, but at first glance you wouldn't know it, and that suits me quite well. Let's just take edge off that. Okay, that's there and there or thereabouts. Once I've done all of that, for the final parts of the image, if I use, if I'm going to create a black and white, or I'm going to use one of the various tools, then the first thing I do is stamp visible, which is Shift, Alt, Command and E. And then I'm going to turn that into a smart object. I'm then going to save it. I always save it because so many of these tools are clunky and crash even on my new iMac. Now I've got some choices here. I'm going to start, as I thought this would be a black and white. So I use Silver Efex Pro for all our black and whites. And I have a series of presets here with different levels of structure. Great. I mean, if you want to do black and whites, this is the tool. It's absolutely brilliant. I haven't yet found anything that gets close. Oh, I quite like that. You can just see the rain up there. That's there or thereabouts, possibly a bit bright. Let's knock the brightness back a tad. And it's at this point where all of the work you've put in on the skin retouch and the shaping really comes to the fore. Okay, have a quick look at the histogram. One of the nice things about this is it has a variant of the zone system, so you can roll a mouse over here and see all the different bits, all the things in different zones. So I'd expect the skin to sit in zones 8 and 9. Yeah, that's about right. And I've obviously got some pretty dark shadows around the edges, but they're all around the edges, and that's fine by me. So I'm going to stick with that. Which is not bad at all. If I want to, if I just knock the transparency back a little bit on this, you get one of those, what is very current, this look, this sort of slightly degraded look. You can take your pick on that. I think in the end I'll probably stick with black and white. I'll put a colour tone on it, and there's lots and lots of ways of doing it, but one of them is to use a colour balance layer, and if you want a really nice copper tone rather, there you go, 23, 11 and 1 gives you really nice copper tone to the mids. Sorry, I should just say that's the mid tones that I'm adjusting there. If you wanted to change the highlights, you could change the paper white. You can get a more duotone look. And there we go. There's the finished image. At this point, I almost never crop in Photoshop. What I would do is save it back to Lightroom, and then I would crop it in Lightroom. The reason for doing that, if I decide at a later time, or the team need a different crop of an image, just straighten it a bit further, then we can just go back to Lightroom. I don't have to redo the edit and open up the file again. One thing to note, depending on your crop, particularly with images shot on a wide angle lens, you sometimes have to align the vertical of your image. Whatever's in the middle of a crop, unless you're deliberately raking the angle, should be vertical. So very often I find once I've recropped an image, it doesn't look quite straight, and I'll reset the angles. So there you go. I might take just the edge off this. Oh, I'm not sure that's adding much.
And that's more or less how I'd like it. And at that point, we would just run all of the JPEGs. And our particular I've written scripts and all sorts of Photoshop. And this generates all of our files that we might need in the future. And on that happy note, I hope that's useful. Enjoy.